He is enormous. Even now, crumpled in the mud at the edge of a conquered city, his frame is something you do not easily forget. Broad-shouldered, thick-necked, a man built like a siege engine wrapped in flesh and iron, a Rus warrior, one of the most feared human beings alive in 943 to 944 AD. His chainmail shirt, still stained dark from the blood of men he cut down in this very city weeks before, is twisted around his torso. He is not clutching a sword, he is clutching his stomach. His knees are pressed into the wet earth of Barda'a. He is groaning. Around him, in every direction, with the Caucasus ranges rising beyond the Kura River plain, there are hundreds more just like him. Giants in the mud. Enormous northern men, warriors who crossed the Caspian Sea in longships, who rode up the Kura River in battle formation, who smashed through the best army the local governor could throw at them in under an hour, all of them writhing, sweating, doubled over in agony, their faces the colour of old wax. The smell that hangs over the camp is not the smell of war. It is not the copper and iron reek of a battlefield. This smell is different, sweet and rotten at the same time. Putrid, the kind of stench that comes from the inside of a man when his body is destroying itself from within. There are no Muslim soldiers doing this to them. There is no catapult, no siege engine, no poison arrow. It is the fruit, the melons, grapes, garden produce, and the gorgeous sun-warmed abundance of the Caucasian summer, which these northern warriors, who had never in their lives tasted anything like it, had gorged themselves on for weeks with the gleeful, careless enthusiasm of conquerors who believed themselves invincible. And now the fruit was killing them, slowly, horribly, in their hundreds. Honestly, when you first read this in the Chronicles, it stops you dead. I remember sitting with Ibn Miskawayh's account for the first time and genuinely laughing, not because it is funny, but because of the sheer, savage irony of it. These men crossed a sea. They rode up a river into the heart of a foreign civilization. They defeated every soldier sent against them. They occupied a wealthy, ancient, walled city. They held thousands of people hostage, and then they were undone by fruit. This is the story of the Rus seizure of Barda'a in 943 to 944 AD, and it is one of the most extraordinary, brutal, and deeply strange episodes in all of medieval history. But to understand why these men are dying in the mud of Azerbaijan, you need to go back past the groaning camp, back past the ransom negotiations and the massacres and the hostage-taking, all the way to the beginning, to the cold grey waters of the Caspian Sea, to the moment a fleet of northern warships, crewed by men who did not know defeat, came over the horizon. To understand what the Rus were doing in Azerbaijan in 943 to 944 AD, you need to understand what Barda'a was, because this was not some backwater town they happened to stumble across. Barda'a, known also as Barda'a, Partau, or Barda, was the jewel of Aran, the prosperous Islamic province that sat in the low, fertile country between the Kura and Araxes rivers, in what is today the Republic of Azerbaijan. Founded, or at least greatly expanded, under the Sasanians in the age of Peroz I, and later fortified under Kavad I, the city had grown across the centuries into the most important urban centre in the southern Caucasus. The anonymous 10th century Persian geography book known as the Hudud al-Alam, the regions of the world, described it as the large and pleasant capital of the Islamic province of Aran. That description barely does it justice. Barda'a sat at the intersection of trade routes that connected the Silk Road world to the Caspian Basin, and the city's markets overflowed with silk, fine mules, grain, metalwork and goods from as far away as Central Asia and the Byzantine Empire. Its population was dense, its mosques were grand, and its streets were full of merchants, craftsmen, scholars and soldiers. This was a city of real throbbing wealth, and the Rus knew it. This is something scholars sometimes underestimate about the Eastern Vikings, about these Varangian Rus who pushed not only west toward England and France, but also east and south through these Baltic, the forest river systems, the steep routes, and eventually beyond. They were not blind raiders stumbling around foreign territory in the dark. They had been navigating the Caspian world since the mid-9th century. The Arab scholar Ibn Khurdadbi, writing in the 9th century, already documented Rus merchants travelling through Khaza territory to the Caspian Sea and beyond, reaching the Abbasid Caliphate, Central Asia, and further. The 10th century historian Ibn Miskawayh, one of our most important primary sources for the events of 943 to 944 AD, opens his account of the Barda'a campaign with a description of the Rus that makes clear just how seriously the Islamic world took these men. He writes that they are a powerful people who are naturally strong and very courageous, who do not know defeat, and none of whose men turns away from battle until he is either killed or kills his opponent. He describes how each man carries a pounding weapon fastened to himself, how they are most skillful with the axe and the hammer, and how they fight mainly on foot with spear and shield, wearing swords strapped to their bodies. This is not the description of ignorant barbarians. This is the description of professional killers with a reputation that preceded them across half the known world. The expedition of 943 to 944 AD was not the first time the Rus had raided the Caspian region. Around 913 AD, a massive Rus fleet had already entered the Caspian with the permission of the Khazar Khagan, cut a bloody swath along the southwestern shoreline, and then be massacred on the return journey by Khazar Muslim mercenaries seeking revenge for the communities destroyed. That earlier catastrophe had not stopped them. If anything, it had sharpened their focus. The Rus who came south in 943 to 944 AD came with a different kind of ambition. This was no longer a simple smash-and-grab raid. The scale of the operation, the choice of target, and what they did once they captured Barda'a all suggest something more deliberate. The possibility, genuinely considered by modern scholars, that these men intended to stay, that they were attempting a conquest. The expedition launched from somewhere along the Volga River system. The exact point of departure is lost to us, and neither Ibn Miskawayh nor Ibn al-Athir specifies it. And the Rus made their way down through Khazar territory to the Caspian Sea. The sea itself they knew well by this point, knew its storms and its currents and its coastal geography. They sailed south and west along the western shore of the Caspian, the same dark waters that had seen their predecessors come and go in blood, and they found the mouth of the Kura River. The Kura is a serious river. It rises high in the mountains of northeastern Turkey, cuts through the Georgian highlands, and then descends in long sweeping curves through the lowlands of Azerbaijan, before emptying into the Caspian. In the 10th century its lower course ran through the heart of Aran, and its current carried the Rus ships deep into the interior of the province, past reed marshes and flat agricultural plains, past small villages whose inhabitants surely stared in disbelief at the dark shapes of northern warships moving inland against the current, oars beating in measured strokes. They were heading for Barda'a, specifically for Barda'a. Word of the approaching fleet did reach the city before the Rus arrived. It had to. A fleet of warships rowing up a major river is not a subtle thing. MARZUBAN ibn Muhammad, the Salarid ruler of Azerbaijan, known also by the dynastic name Musafirid after his father Muhammad ibn Musafir, had been in control of the province since 941 AD, but was not personally in Barda'a when the Rus appeared. His representative, his naib, his deputy governor, was the man left to deal with the crisis, and to his credit he moved quickly. He assembled the largest force he could manage on short notice, somewhere in the region of 5,000 men, according to the chronicles, a combination of Dalamite troops, hardy mountain soldiers from the Caspian highlands of northern Iran, who formed much of the military muscle of the region's armies, along with volunteers, Kurdish fighters, and whatever local garrison troops the city could muster. 300 Dalamites specifically, plus a similar number described as Suluks and Kurds, according to Miskawayh's more detailed tally. It was not nothing. In most circumstances, a well-organised Muslim force of 5,000 soldiers defending home territory against a river-borne raiding party would be a significant obstacle. These were not most circumstances. The Rus landed on the Kura plain near the village of Mubaraki, which sat at the gate of Barda'a itself, and the two forces met in open battle. What happened next was over in moments. Ibn al-Athir writes with clinical brevity that it was only a short time until the Muslims were routed and the Dalamites were killed to the last man. Every soldier who had a horse fled. Every soldier who remained on foot was cut down where he stood. The deputy governor himself ran, grabbing whatever riding animal he could find. Miskawayh is even more stark in his description, recording that within approximately 1 hour of the engagement beginning, the battle was finished and the road to the city lay open. When you read those accounts side by side and let the timeline sink in, 5,000 men, 1 hour, done, It gives you a genuine chill. These northern warriors had crossed half a continent to stand in a field outside a city they intended to own, and the defenders simply could not stop them. The Rus entered Barda'a, and this is where the story becomes complicated in ways that most retellings miss entirely, because what happened in those first days was not the immediate wave of looting and killing that you might expect. According to both Miskawayh and Ibn al-Athir, the Rus initially presented themselves to the population of the city in almost diplomatic terms. When they marched through the gates, their commanders made proclamations. They had come only to rule. They wished to possess the governance of the city. The local people were free to practice their religion. The Rus wished only to be obeyed, and in return they promised to treat the population fairly. They would not interfere with the Muslim community's religious life. Personally, when I read this section of Miskawayh's account, I find it the most unsettling part of the whole episode. More unsettling, in some ways, than the violence that came later, because this is a calculated political act. These men were not mindless berserkers who swung their axes at everyone in reach. They had a plan. They understood that a city full of cowering, fleeing, burned-out people is worthless to a conqueror. A city whose population submits, stays, continues to work and trade and produce, that is something worth holding. The wealthy classes of Barda'a apparently understood this logic and accepted the Rus terms. But the common people of the city did not. What happened next set in motion a chain of violence that would define the occupation. The ordinary inhabitants of Barda'a, the craftsmen, the market traders, the labourers, the masses of people who had everything to lose and no cavalry horse to ride to safety, began throwing stones at the Rus. Miskawayh notes that some of these stone throwers were actually giving cover to Muslim soldiers who had surrounded the city from the outside, trying to keep pressure on the Rus from within the walls. The Rus forbade it. They issued warnings. The stone-throwing continued. And so the Rus commanders delivered an ultimatum. Every inhabitant of the city had 3 days to leave, taking whatever possessions they could carry. After 3 days, no mercy would be given to those who remained. 3 days is not a long time to abandon a city where your family has lived for generations, where your workshop is, your animals, your grain stores, your entire life. The wealthy had already made their accommodations with the new rulers. The genuinely poor had nowhere to go and no means of transport. The elderly could not move fast enough. The stubborn refused to flee from their own homes. The result was that when the 3 days expired, the majority of Barda'a's population was still inside the walls. The Rus kept their word. What followed was a massacre. The chronicles describe the Rus killing many people and taking a great number of souls captive. Those who were not immediately killed were herded into the Friday Mosque, the great congregational mosque of the city, the spiritual heart of the Muslim community, and an offer was made. Each prisoner could ransom himself for 20 dirhams, a sum negotiated through a Christian intermediary who came forward to broker the deal. 20 dirhams a head. It was not an impossible sum for a prosperous merchant. It was utterly beyond the reach of an ordinary labourer. The women and children were held separately, confined in the Sharistan, the great fortified inner quarter of the city, the walled urban core that served as both residential district and defensive stronghold, where Miskawayh records them being subjected to assault and enslavement by the occupying forces. For those men in the mosque who could not pay, or who refused to pay, because some of the Muslim captives reportedly considered it humiliation to submit to Christian terms, which is what 20 dirhams to a Rus captor effectively represented in their eyes, the result was death. Ibn al-Athir records that the Rus did not keep their ransom bargain with most of the prisoners, massacring those for whom no money was forthcoming. Only a few managed to escape the killing in the mosque. The city's valuables were systematically looted, the remaining free population reduced to slavery, and the Sharistan converted into the Rus garrison's primary base of operations, its thick walls now serving the conquerors rather than the conquered. In the days and weeks that followed, the Rus settled into Barda'a as something that looked disturbingly like an occupation force intending to stay. They established administrative control, or at least their version of it, over the surrounding countryside. They used the city as a base from which to send raiding parties deep into the adjacent regions of Aran, stripping the towns and villages of anything portable and valuable: gold, silver, silk, livestock, more captives. Ibn al-Athir's text even preserves a reference to an advance in the direction of Marga, though scholars have warned that this reading may be corrupt. The safer point is that their raiding pressure extended beyond Barda'a itself. The treasure they were accumulating was substantial enough that it would later be specifically mentioned as a defining feature of the siege's aftermath. When the Muslims who eventually retook the city found themselves unearthing not just Rus weapons from the graves of the dead, but evidence of the staggering wealth these men had gathered during their months of occupation. Meanwhile, Marzuban ibn Muhammad, the ruler who had been absent when the Rus arrived, was gathering his response. He was not a man to accept the loss of his richest provincial capital without a fight, and he began assembling a large army from across his territories. But he was also a careful, calculating ruler who understood something crucial about the Rus that his unfortunate deputy had not. You could not beat these men in a straightforward pitched battle. The earlier catastrophe had demonstrated that with terrible finality. MARZUBAN'S strategy would need to be more patient, more indirect, more willing to wait. And as it turned out, something else was already doing the waiting for him. Something that no army, no general, and no strategy could have engineered on purpose. Something growing in the orchards and gardens of Barda'a, ripening in the Caucasian summer heat, golden and swollen and deadly. Something the Rus had never tasted before and could not stop eating. But that story, the silent apocalypse that would break these undefeated giants, belongs to what came next. The city was theirs. Every gate, every wall, every alley and market stall and mosque courtyard, all of it now belonged to the Rus, and they knew exactly what to do with it. What is easy to miss when you read the chronicles of this occupation is how methodical it all was. There was nothing random about what the Rus did in Barda'a once they had cleared the streets of resistors and locked the survivors into the Friday mosque. This was not looting for its own sake, not the mindless destruction of men who had simply gone mad with violence. There was a system here, a pricing structure, a commercial logic so cold and precise that it feels almost modern, like a criminal enterprise running a protection racket through the most prosperous city in the Caucasus. 20 dirhams per head, that was the number. If you were a merchant, a craftsman, a man of any means at all, you could walk out of that mosque alive and relatively intact, provided you could produce 20 dirhams in silver and hand it over through the Christian intermediary who had stepped forward to negotiate the deal. If you could not, or would not, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. The Friday Mosque of Barda'a was one of the great religious buildings of the region, a high-ceilinged, cool-stoned space designed for prayer and community, a place where tens of thousands of worshippers had gathered over the centuries for Friday services, for festivals, for the collective rituals of Islamic urban life. Now it was a holding pen. The smell inside must have been extraordinary, the dense, pressing, frightened stench of thousands of men crammed into a space built for congregation but not for confinement. Men who'd been watching their neighbours and friends be killed in the streets outside. Men who did not know whether the silver in their pockets was enough to buy their lives, or whether the enormous foreign warriors standing at the doors would simply kill them anyway once the money ran out. And that fear, it turned out, was entirely justified. The Rus did not honour their ransom agreement across the board. The chronicle accounts make this uncomfortably clear. Those prisoners for whom the intermediary could not produce payment, or for whom the Rus simply decided, in their own judgment, that further waiting was pointless, were killed. Not ransomed, not enslaved and transported north for later sale, not released on some future promise of payment, killed. Right there in or around the mosque that had been meant to serve as a place of temporary safety. Only a small fraction of the total captive population managed to escape the killing, slipping out through whatever cracks and darkened doorways and moments of inattention they could exploit. The rest died, their bodies adding to the already considerable number of dead that the Rus occupation had produced in its opening days. It is worth pausing here, because this is the moment in the story where I think you really feel the weight of what was happening to ordinary people caught inside a war they had no part in starting. The craftsmen, the bread sellers, the water carriers, the students at the mosque school, the old men who had lived in the same neighbourhood their entire lives and had nowhere to run and no cavalry horse to carry them to safety. These are the people filling that mosque, their fates being decided by a currency transaction negotiated through a middleman. 20 dirhams. Some of them had it, most of them didn't. The difference between those two groups was the difference between surviving the morning and not surviving it. That is not heroic history. That is just the grinding, impersonal brutality of what conquest actually looks like when you strip away the battlefield drama The women and children of Barda'a faced a different kind of horror. Gathered and confined separately in the Sharistan, they were at the immediate mercy of the occupying garrison. The chronicles record assault and enslavement without particular elaboration, because to the medieval authors recording these events, it was simply the expected consequence of a city falling to a conquering force. Expected, but no less devastating for the people experiencing it. The Sharistan, that same fortified urban core whose walls had been designed to protect the city's most vulnerable inhabitants from outside attack, had become instead the place where those protections meant nothing at all. Outside the walls, meanwhile, the situation was not sitting still. Marzuban ibn Muhammad had known about the Rus presence in his territory since before they even reached Barda'a, and while his deputy had failed catastrophically in open battle, Marzuban himself was not without resources or resolution. He was a Salarid ruler, a member of the Iranian Muslim dynasty that had controlled Azerbaijan since around 941 AD, and he was a man with both military experience and, crucially, a sharp enough political mind to understand that he could not simply throw his army at the Rus the same way his deputy had and expect a different result. The earlier battle had demonstrated that a frontal engagement against these warriors on open ground was a losing proposition, so he did not do that. Instead, he sent probing forces, skirmishing detachments, cavalry raids, light infantry harassment that tested the Rus perimeter without ever fully committing to a decisive assault. The Rus, for their part, were strong enough to repel these attacks without great difficulty, but not reckless enough to abandon the security of the city in pursuit of an enemy who would simply melt away into the countryside. This produced a peculiar stalemate. The Rus held Barda'a completely. They controlled its gates, its food supplies, its remaining population, and its accumulated wealth. But they could not easily move beyond the city limits without risking an engagement on MARZUBAN'S terms rather than their own, and MARZUBAN'S harassing tactics, constant probing, never quite escalating to full battle, kept pressure on the garrison without providing the Rus with a clear enemy to destroy. Ibn al-Athir records specifically that MARZUBAN'S forces fought the Rus in the mornings and in the evenings, hitting them at the edges of the day when visibility was changing and coordination was harder, then pulling back before the full weight of Rus fighting discipline could be brought to bear. It was an intelligent, patient strategy, and it speaks well of MARZUBAN'S military instincts that he recognised so quickly the particular kind of threat he was dealing with. The occupation settled into its routines. The Rus sent raiding parties out from Barda'a into the surrounding agricultural countryside, stripping the villages and smaller towns of Iran of whatever remained after MARZUBAN'S people had fled or hidden their most valuable possessions. Gold and silver accumulated in the Sharistan. Silk, weapons, horses, livestock. The material wealth of one of the most productive provinces in the Caucasian world piled up inside the citadel walls in quantities that would still be talked about years later, after the Rus were gone. The raiding parties probed deeper and deeper into the province, with one textual tradition even mentioning Moraga, though that reading is probably uncertain. The reliable point is still telling. The raiding pressure was not limited to the city walls. These men were not thinking like raiders anymore. They were thinking like rulers, or at least trying to. Back in the occupied city, the ransom economy continued. People who had managed to hide during the initial massacres, or who had fled into the surrounding countryside and then crept back, found themselves subject to the same brutal mathematics as everyone else. Produce your silver, or face the consequences. The Christian intermediary who had negotiated the initial mosque ransom appears to have continued operating as a go-between for subsequent transactions, a pragmatic arrangement that suited both sides. The Rus needed someone who could communicate with the population and manage the flow of money. The intermediary needed to avoid being killed himself. The surviving population of Barda'a needed someone who could at least provide the illusion of a structured process, some framework of negotiation that gave desperate people a reason to believe that payment might actually produce safety. It was a grotesque arrangement. But it was an arrangement, which is sometimes the most that people trapped inside a military occupation can hope for. What the chronicles give us almost no insight into is the daily texture of life for the Rus warriors themselves during these weeks of occupation. We see them from the outside, through the eyes of Arabic and Persian historians writing from a Muslim perspective, reporting the atrocities, tallying the dead, recording the political movements of rulers and armies. We do not get the view from inside the Sharistan, from the perspective of the men quartered in a conquered Caucasian city, eating food they had never encountered before, sleeping in buildings constructed in architectural traditions entirely foreign to them, hearing a language they could not understand spoken in the markets and alleys around them. We do not know how they organized their command structure, who their leader was, what they called themselves, or what they planned to do when, or if, Marzuban finally gathered enough strength for a real assault. The Arabic sources give that leader a title, an emir, a prince or commander, but no name. He is the nameless leader of an expedition that changed the history of the region, and he will die in a Muslim ambush without his name ever being recorded in any source that has survived. But here is what we do know about the daily life of the garrison in Barda'a during the summer and early autumn months of 943 to 944 AD. We know what they were eating, and that, as it turns out, is where the entire story begins to turn. The orchards and gardens of Barda'a and its surrounding countryside were famous enough in the sources for their abundance to matter to the story. The Kura River plain in Azerbaijan receives adequate rainfall, sits in a favourable climate zone between the Caucasus Mountains and the warm influence of the Caspian Sea, and produces fruit of exceptional quality and variety. The chronicles do not need to name every fruit. They simply describe numerous kinds of fruit and garden produce, enough ripe abundance for a northern army to gorge itself without discipline. The local population had grown up with the water, the soil, the orchards, and the ordinary microbial environment of that particular valley. The Rus warriors had grown up in the northern river world, in a climate of long winters and short summers, of preserved foods, root vegetables, dried fish, and whatever animals they could hunt or husband through the cold months. They had never in their lives encountered anything like a Caucasian summer orchard in full production, and when they found one, or dozens of them, the gardens of an entire abandoned city overflowing with ripe fruit in the midsummer heat, they did exactly what any cold country man does when he suddenly has access to something impossibly good and impossibly abundant. They ate as much as they possibly could. Before we get to the plague, and trust me, you want to be fully present for what comes next, I just want to take 30 seconds to say something directly to you. If you're watching this video, you are the exact kind of person this channel exists for. You are not here for oversimplified history. You are here because you want the real story, the complicated, bloody, stranger-than-fiction truth of what actually happened in the medieval world. That takes serious research, proper production, and a huge amount of time. If you want to support the work directly and keep this channel alive and growing, the best thing you can do is simple. Subscribe, watch to the end, share the video with someone who loves history, and leave a comment. No corporate sponsor telling me what to say. Just you keeping this kind of storytelling going, right? Back to the dying giants of Barda'a. It started quietly. That is what makes it so insidious, so difficult to even identify in the moment it is happening. There was no sudden catastrophe. No morning when a scout burst into the Shahristan and reported that a plague had descended on the camp overnight. It came in the way that dysentery and epidemic illness always come to occupying armies. Gradually, confusingly, one man sick here and two more there, the kind of low-level physical misery that soldiers in a long occupation learn to dismiss and push through, right up until the point where they cannot push through anymore, and the men who were getting sick were enormous, physically massive, among the most physically capable human beings in the 10th century world. That is the detail that keeps striking me every time I sit with this part of the story. These were not frail men, not poorly nourished men, not men whose bodies had been worn down by years of deprivation and poor diet. The Rus warriors who occupied Barda'a were, by every account that has survived them, specimens of exceptional physical power. Ibn Miskawayh, who gives us our most vivid descriptions of the Rus physique, records their extraordinary size and strength with something approaching awe. These were men who had rowed hundreds of miles down river systems and across open sea, men whose upper bodies were built for sustained, punishing labour, men whose entire lives had conditioned them to cold, hardship, violence, and endurance. They were not supposed to be killable by summer fruit, but that is exactly what was killing them. The key to understanding why is simple biology dressed up as tragedy, though we have to be careful not to overstate what the medieval sources can prove medically. The Rus had come from a northern climate where the growing season is short, where the fruit available, berries, hard apples, preserved things, dried provisions, is modest in variety and quantity, and where a man's digestive system develops over a lifetime to process a specific range of foods efficiently. The Caucasian summer, with its overwhelming abundance of fruit ripening across the orchards and gardens of a wealthy, occupied city, presented these northerners with something their bodies could not handle in the quantities they were consuming. Ibn Miskawayh is precise on this point, writing that the Rus indulged excessively in the fruit, of which there are numerous sorts there, and that this produced an epidemic among them, and their numbers began thereby to be reduced. Not just 1 or 2 men, not a handful of unlucky individuals with particularly weak constitutions, their numbers, plural, in quantity sufficient to be described as an epidemic. The word epidemic covers a lot of brutal physiological reality. What the chronicles describe as a fruit-induced illness maps most directly onto what we would today call acute gastrointestinal infection, compounded by dysentery, a condition that, in the absence of modern medical intervention, kills through dehydration, systemic collapse, and the cascading failure of organ systems that have been pushed past their limits. For a northern man gorging on unfamiliar local fruit, combined very likely with unfamiliar water sources and microbes his body had never encountered, the result could be swift and merciless. The stomach cramps would have come first, deep, seizing, doubling over pain that would have made it impossible to stand up straight, let alone carry a shield or swing an axe. Then the fever. Then the progressive weakness as the body lost water and strength faster than it could recover, until no amount of northern courage or warrior discipline could fight against it. Honestly, when I picture this in my mind, I find it almost impossible to reconcile the two images. The image of these men as they arrived in Barda'a, crashing through the Dalamite line in under an hour, unstoppable and terrifying, and the image of those same men 3 or 4 months later, lying in the Sharistan, feverish, dehydrated, and too weak to stand. The distance between those two images is the whole terrible arc of this story. Victory is so absolute and so sudden in 943 to 944 AD. The collapse is so slow, so undignified, so completely immune to the one thing these men were genuinely exceptional at, fighting their way out of trouble. The dead were buried with their weapons. This detail, recorded by Ibn al-Athir with a kind of dry ethnographic interest, is one of the most revealing fragments in the entire account. The Rus buried their weapons with their dead. Every warrior who died of the epidemic was interred with his sword, his axe, his personal armory, the tools of the only trade that gave a Rus warrior his identity and his standing in the world. The chronicler notes this specifically because it is why, after the Rus eventually left Barda'a, the Muslims who entered the city found the graves and exhumed them, recovering weapons of real quality and value from the burial sites of men who had died not in battle but in agony, cramped over in a conquered citadel while summer turned to autumn in the orchards outside. It is a strangely dignified detail inside an undignified catastrophe. Whatever else was happening to these men, their companions honoured the burial customs of the northern world, even in the middle of an epidemic, even deep inside enemy territory, even as their numbers dwindled week by week. Outside the walls, MARZUBAN ibn Muhammad was watching. He had been watching for a long time. His morning and evening skirmishes with the Rus had been going badly. The chroniclers are frank about this, recording that he returned defeated from these encounters, that the Rus fighting quality was simply too high to overcome in any conventional exchange of forces. But MARZUBAN was a patient man, and patient men who are waiting for their enemy to weaken sometimes get exactly what they are waiting for. The reports filtering out of Barda'a, through escaped slaves, through sympathetic locals, through the network of eyes and ears that any medieval military commander keeps working in occupied territory, were telling him what he had not been able to achieve by force. The Rus were sick, they were dying. Their numbers, once so forbiddingly large, were being ground down week after week by an enemy that had no face and carried no sword. The garrison inside the Sharistan was not passive in the face of this pressure. The Rus still had the strength to fight, and MARZUBAN knew it. The problem was not that they had become harmless. The problem was that they were becoming fewer. Every day the illness did what his cavalry and infantry had failed to do in the open field. It cut into their numbers. It wore down their bodies. It thinned the wall of iron that had first burst into Barda'a like a storm. MARZUBAN waited, watched, and tightened the noose, understanding that the decisive clash would come only when the survivors finally tried to break out. The epidemic kept taking them. Week after week, in the close quarters of the citadel, the illness moved through the garrison with the efficient thoroughness of a disease that thrives in exactly the conditions the Rus had created. A large population of men unused to the local environment, crowded together, sharing water sources, sharing food, and carrying the accumulated burden of months of occupation in a climate their bodies had never adapted to handle. There was no medical intervention available to them beyond whatever the warriors themselves knew of their own folk remedies, and northern folk remedies for dysentery were not going to be adequate to what was happening inside those walls. You cannot sweat out dysentery with a cold water bath. You cannot drink it away with mead. You cannot fight it with an axe. The garrison's population was collapsing. The treasure piled inside the Sharistan, the gold, the silver, the silk, the ransomed goods stripped from the wealthiest city in the Caucasus over months of methodical looting, was growing proportionally larger relative to the number of men left alive to defend it. But the next decisive moment was not yet the final escape to the river. First came MARZUBAN'S trap. This matters, because the chronology is easy to blur. The sickened Rus still had enough strength to come out and fight. MARZUBAN understood that. He did not need to storm the citadel. He needed to lure them into motion, make them believe the Muslim line was breaking, and pull their pursuit across ground he had already prepared. So the first serious attempt to break MARZUBAN'S pressure did not come as a clean evacuation. It came as a sally, a chase, an ambush, and then a retreat back into the Sharistan. Only after that disaster, after their commander was dead and the blockade tightened again, would the survivors make their final night movement toward the Kura River. But MARZUBAN was not quite done with them yet. What happened next, outside the walls of Barda'a, was the final brutal chapter of an expedition that had begun with such overwhelming, almost contemptuous confidence. And it began with a trap. MARZUBAN ibn Muhammad had spent months learning the Rus. He had tested them in the mornings and been pushed back. He had tested them in the evenings and been pushed back again. He had watched his best Dalamite soldiers killed in direct engagements, watched his general sorties fail to dent the garrison's fighting discipline, watched the slow grind of epidemic do what his armies could not. And through all of it he had been building toward one moment, a single, decisive tactical stroke that would use the Rus' own offensive instincts against them. He had designed an ambush around the next Rus sally. The mechanics of the plan were elegant in their simplicity, and MARZUBAN himself described it afterward in terms that Ibn al-Athir preserved in direct speech, one of the rare moments in the chronicle where we hear a historical figure's own voice explaining his own thinking, unfiltered by summary or paraphrase. MARZUBAN'S plan was this. He would march toward the Rus with his main force in a visible, conventional engagement, attack them, and then visibly, deliberately retreat. He knew the Rus, he knew their psychology, he knew that warriors of their quality and their specific military culture do not easily resist a fleeing enemy. The pursuit instinct, trained into them by years of raiding and shock combat, would override tactical caution. They would chase, and when they chased, they would run directly into the concealed force that MARZUBAN had already positioned ahead of the line of retreat. It nearly failed. MARZUBAN'S own account of the ambush, as preserved in Ibn al-Athir's chronicle, is one of the most honest and genuinely gripping pieces of military self-reporting in all of medieval Islamic historiography. He describes how his Dalamite troops, when they began the planned retreat and felt the Rus coming hard behind them, broke. Not a controlled withdrawal, a real fear-driven rout. The discipline that the plan required evaporated in the face of that pursuing charge. MARZUBAN watched his men running and understood immediately that if they kept running, the Rus would cut most of them down before the ambush could be sprung. The plan would fail, and his army would be destroyed. He writes that he prepared himself mentally for martyrdom in that moment, a phrase that carries genuine weight in the context of a man who had spent months engineering this exact confrontation. He had imagined dying in this ambush many times before it was sprung, and yet he turned back anyway. He turned his horse and charged back toward the Rus, alone at first. Then his brother turned with him, then his minister. 3 men riding back into the teeth of an undefeated northern war host. And then, because courage is contagious in a way that fear never quite manages to be, the Dalamites felt the shame of it. Their own ruler, riding alone at the enemy while they ran. The shame turned them around. The Daylamites came back to the fight, and with them came the signal that triggered the concealed ambush force, who rose from their hiding places and hit the pursuing Rus from behind and from both flanks simultaneously. The effect was exactly what the plan had intended. The Rus, already weakened by months of epidemic and reduced from their original strength, suddenly found themselves caught between a reformed frontal line and an ambush force closing from behind. The fighting in that moment must have been extraordinary. Even sick, even outnumbered, even exhausted, the individual Rus warriors fought with the same personal ferocity that had defined every engagement in this campaign. MARZUBAN'S account records that they killed many of the Rus, including their prince, the nameless commander who, according to Miskaway, rode on a donkey in the fighting. The leader of the entire expedition was cut down in the chaos of the ambush, his name unrecorded in any source that has come down to us. He died outside a city he had conquered and could not hold, his name lost to history. The remaining Rus fell back. Not a rout, a fighting withdrawal, the kind that speaks of men who have had every possible disaster happen to them and are still not broken, still moving with purpose, still choosing every step. They retreated to the Sharistan, pulling their survivors together behind, those thick fortifications for one last stand. And Marzuban closed the circle around them. He moved his forces into position for a proper siege, not the probing morning and evening skirmishes of the previous months, but a full encirclement, a methodical pressure on every exit, the kind of siege that tells the people inside the walls that there is no path out except through the Muslim army. There was a brief interruption in the siege, and it is worth noting because it reveals how chaotic the political landscape of 10th century Azerbaijan actually was. News reached Marzuban while he had the Rus surrounded that a Hamdanid force, troops sent by the ruler Nasir al-Dawla from Mosul in the Upper Jazeera, had entered Azerbaijan and was moving towards Salmas, in the northwest of the province. The Hamdanids were a rival Muslim dynasty with their own territorial ambitions, and the last thing Marzuban needed while he had the Rus penned inside Barda'a was a second enemy advancing on his rear. He left his forces maintaining the blockade and rode north to deal with the Hamdanid threat, engaging them in a battle that was cut short by a sudden and heavy snowfall that dispersed the Bedouin-heavy Hamdanid army. The Hamdanids withdrew, recalled by their own ruler for reasons related to the chaos further west in the Abbasid Caliphate, and Marzuban returned to find his forces still in position around the Sharistan, still holding the blockade, still doing the patient, grinding work of waiting the Rus out. Inside the Sharistan, the arithmetic was no longer deniable. The epidemic had done its work. The ambush had taken the survivors' leadership. The siege had sealed the exits. The men who remained alive inside those walls, their numbers now a fraction of the fleet that had sailed up the Kura River with such confidence months before, faced a calculation that admitted only one answer. They could not fight their way out in daylight, not anymore, not against the full weight of Marzuban's army with the numbers they had left. But the night offered something that daylight didn't. Confusion, darkness, the possibility that a disciplined, quiet, organised movement through the city in the small hours might reach the river before the Muslim forces could fully respond. They made their preparations with the methodical care of men who had lived their entire lives by the principle that preparation is the difference between coming home and not coming home. Everything that could be carried was loaded. The gold and silver that they had accumulated across months of occupation, the gems and fine clothing stripped from the wealthiest households in Aran, and whatever captives they still intended to carry north. Whatever could not be carried was left where it was. The weapons of men who had already died were already in the ground, buried with their owners in the Rus tradition. Everything else, the bulkier plunder, the possessions that had no handles and no way of being strapped to a man's back, was abandoned in the Sharistan, left for Marzuban's soldiers to find in the morning. And then, in the deep night, they moved. The chronicles do not give us the hour or the route or the specific sequence of events that unfolded as the surviving Rus made their way through the darkened streets of Barda'a toward the Kura River and the ships waiting downstream. What we know is the bare bones of the outcome. They made it. Not all of them. The Muslim forces were maintaining the blockade, and the departure could not have been entirely silent or entirely uncontested. But enough of them made it. The men who had been waiting with the ships throughout the occupation were there, as promised, with the vessels ready and provisioned. The survivors loaded themselves, their treasure, and any captives they still carried onto the Longships pushed off into the current of the Kura and let the river carry them back toward the Caspian Sea and the long route north. MARZUBAN'S forces were too exhausted to pursue them effectively. This is the detail that feels almost anticlimactic but is, in its own way, the most human moment in the entire account. The Muslim army that had fought these men across months of skirmishing and epidemic and siege, that had finally broken them at the ambush and closed the walls around them, simply did not have enough left to run after them into the night. They had done what they needed to do. The Rus were leaving. The city was recovered. The men who had survived the Kura, the dysentery, the ambush, and the siege were somebody else's problem now, receding upriver in the darkness with whatever remained of their ruinous northern treasure. What was left behind in Barda'a was a city changed beyond recognition. The population that had survived the occupation, the ransom payers, the escapees, the people who had been hiding in the countryside and crept back once the fighting was over, returned to streets still marked by the violence of the initial conquest. The Friday mosque where the first mass killings had occurred, the Sharistan with its abandoned plunder, the graves of the Rus dead, their weapons buried alongside them in the northern fashion, waiting to be found by the first Muslim soldier who thought to look. And the orchards, still producing, still beautiful, still laden with the same local abundance that had helped destroy this extraordinary raiding force more thoroughly than any army had managed, the fruit and water of Barda'a, innocent in themselves, catastrophic in combination with the particular vulnerability of the men who could not stop eating. Ibn al-Athir ends his account of the episode with a phrase that is simple and final and carries the full weight of the Islamic world's sense of what had happened. And so Allah cleansed the Rus from the land. 7 words. A theological interpretation nailed onto a military and biological reality. Whether you share that theology or not, the underlying reality is one of the most extraordinary stories of unintended consequence in medieval military history. An undefeated army, destroyed by abundance, conquerors killed by their own appetite. The greatest siege weapon deployed against the Rus in Barda'a was the orchard itself. The treasure they left behind, the gold and silver coins, the gems, the silk, the weapons unearthed from the graves, was redistributed by MARZUBAN among his soldiers and administrators, a tangible reward for the months of patience and attrition that had eventually produced their recovery of the city. The captives carried north disappear from the record after the Longships left the Kura River. Their commander was dead in an ambush, his name unrecoverable. The surviving warriors who made it back to the Caspian and then to the Volga, and eventually to Kievan Rus territory, carried with them something unusual for men of their world and their reputation. The memory of a campaign that went perfectly right and then catastrophically wrong, not because of superior enemy soldiers, not simply because of tactical mistakes on the battlefield, not because of cowardice, but because the world they invaded was biologically unfamiliar in ways that no amount of skill or courage or iron discipline could overcome. The Rus never came back to Barda'a. The city recovered over the following decades, rebuilt itself, resumed its place in the trade networks of the Caucasian world. MARZUBAN ibn Muhammad later survived capture by the Buyids around 949 to 950 EAD, recovered his position, and ruled until his death in 957, another chapter in the relentlessly complicated political history of a region that never stayed quiet for long. The Kievan Rus state, under Igor of Kiev, who was likely the supreme political authority during this expedition, even if he was not personally present at Barda'a, went on to its own complicated destiny. Igor himself assassinated by the Drevlian tribe barely 2 years after the Barda'a expedition returned, in 945 AD. The Kura kept flowing to the Caspian, indifferent to everything that had happened on its banks. The graves in Barda'a were opened, the weapons were taken out, the swords and axes and fighting tools of men who had crossed a continent to die of fruit in a Caucasian summer were carried away, repurposed, traded, lost. By the time the Muslim world's chroniclers were writing up the definitive account of what had happened at Barda'a, the men themselves were already becoming myth. Those terrifying northern giants who came by sea, who could not be stopped by soldiers, who fell at last to the invisible armies of the Caucasian summer. A story so strange that later generations sometimes doubted it was real. A story so well documented in such careful detail, by such reliable witnesses, that there is no honest way to doubt it at all. Personally, I think this is one of those stories that history keeps alive because it says something true about the limits of human power that we need to keep hearing, These men were as capable and as dangerous as any warriors the medieval world produced. They were not stupid, not reckless, not undisciplined. They had a plan. They executed it brilliantly. They won the early military contest with terrifying speed and remained dangerous until the end. And none of it was enough. The world they invaded was bigger than they were. Not in military terms, but in biological ones, in climatological ones, in the deep ordinary reality of fruit ripening in an orchard on the wrong side of the world from where you were born. That is the brutal truth of Barda'a. Not a glorious defeat, not a heroic last stand. Just 2,000 miles of river and sea and mountain, ending in a ditch outside a city whose fruit you could not stop eating. There is a version of this story that gets told as a curiosity, a footnote, a strange little anecdote about Vikings eating too much fruit. I hope, after everything we have been through, that version feels completely inadequate to you. Because what actually happened at Barda'a in 943 to 944 AD was not a footnote. It was a window, a clear, well-documented, extraordinarily vivid window into the full complexity of what medieval warfare and medieval conquest actually looked like when you strip away the legend and get down to the ground level, where the mud is wet and the fruit is rotting and the enormous warrior in chainmail is not dying. The death his culture promised him, but a slower, stranger, more honest one. The Rus at Barda'a were not victims of bad luck in the trivial sense. They were victims of the fundamental arrogance of conquest, the assumption that because you have defeated every enemy who has come at you with a weapon, you have defeated the place itself. You haven't. The place keeps going after the battle is over. The climate keeps being what it is. The orchards keep ripening. The water keeps carrying what it carries. The unfamiliar microbes of the Kura plain, the invisible life clinging to local water and fruit during the occupation, had been there longer than the Kievan Rus state had existed, and they were there long after the last Rus longship disappeared around the bend of the Kura River heading north. Victory in the battle is not the same as mastery of the land. That lesson, written in the graves of hundreds of northern warriors buried with their weapons in foreign soil, is as true today as it was 1,200 years ago. If you made it to the end of this video, genuinely, thank you. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, and it takes a serious amount of research and work to do it properly. If this video gave you something, a story you didn't know, a detail that stayed with you, a moment where history felt genuinely alive, then the best thing you can do is subscribe to the channel. Hit that button. It costs nothing. It tells the algorithm that this kind of content is worth surfacing, and it means the next video gets seen by more people who would love it. Leave a comment below with the detail that shocked you most. I genuinely read them, and the conversations in the comments on these videos are some of the best historical discussions I have anywhere. And if you want to go deeper, the related videos linked on screen right now will take you further into the world of Varangian Rus warfare and Caucasian history. We are just getting started.